Hello, my name is Tony. I'm at a loss to adequately explain why no one seemed to like this film when it first hit the screens. Richard Burton, the star, rumoured as a last-minute replacement for Nicole Williamson, is on record as saying, "I fought like a madman against doing it. He got 500,000 quid for agreeing to 3 weeks' work, so I guess the short commitment required and the fee in hand swayed his decision." Anyway, he was off to make The Wild Geese next, and that was a box office hit, restoring something of his reputation and bankability. The effete film snob Roger Ebert called it the worst film of 1978, and most of his peers either side of the pond didn't rate it much higher. Neither did the public storm the ticket offices en masse. It didn't do the rounds for long, soon dropped off the circuit, and popped up again 5 or so years later in the odd TV screening in the 80s, usually on a Sunday night, before fading quietly away. Well, stuff all that phony baloney bullshit because I really like it, and consider it a standout contender in the telekinesis or psychokinesis movie subgenre of the 60s, 70s and early 80s. What, you didn't know there was such a subgenre? Well, there was, and it was driven by a flaky new age interest in the subject that flared up in the 60s and 70s, popularised by masquerading stage magician charlatans like Uri Geller. Geller made millions mangling canteens of cutlery on primetime TV and convincing the gullible that he did it with the power of his mind. People held PK parties where bright young things and pseudo-intellectual student deadbeats sat around trying to move objects with the power of thought. The sort of people who experienced the most extreme difficulty in moving their bowels to clear the surplus shit they were full of, or translate a thought into any meaningful action. You know, wankers commonly. In 1968, the film The Power, featuring Hollywood poodle faker George Hamilton and glued eyelash goddess Suzanne Plachette, seemingly kicked off the trend. We had a trashy low-rent psychic killer in 1975 with Julie Adams and Jim Hutton. Things then got more mainstream with Brian De Palma's box office hit version of Stephen King's novel Carrie in 1976, the Aussie cult entry Patrick in 78, and De Palma again with Kirk Douglas running and jumping about in The Fury the same year. David Cronenberg's Scanners in 1981 was probably the peak point of the sporadic craze, belatedly followed by another King adaptation, Firestarter, in 1984. At a push, you could add Cronenberg's version of yet another Stephen King novel, The Dead Zone, in 1983, but that was more about precognition than telekinesis, so its inclusion is largely iffy to say the least. For me, what makes the Medusa Touch one of the better horror thrillers of the telekinetic stripe is the presence of Richard Burton in the lead, the understated direction of Jack Gold, a slick and slyly black-humoured script by John Briley, who would later pen Richard Attenborough as Gandhi, yep, go figure, and the question the film poses: what would happen if a bitter, haunted, rage-driven misanthrope had the power to cause death and disaster by simply wishing it? Author John Mauler, Richard Burton, is watching TV in his London apartment. It's a news report about a NASA space mission. The ship inexplicably trapped in orbit around the moon. All contact with the crew has been lost. He is bludgeoned to death, or so it seems, by an unknown assailant. French detective Brunel, Lino Ventura, on an exchange program to London, is sent to investigate. He finds to his and everyone else's surprise that Mauler is still alive, and gets him rushed to hospital, where he spends the rest of the film swayed in bandages on life support, like a patient in Carry On Doctor, and played by a stand-in who obviously isn't Richard Burton. Brunel's investigations lead him to Mauler's psychiatrist, Dr. Zonfeld, Lee Remick. With her help and Mauler's journals, he forms a picture of the man's life, which is represented in Flashbacks featuring Burton. Mauler engages the services of Dr. Zonfeld in an attempt to convince another person what he can do is real and to figure out what he is.
"I have a gift for disaster,"
he tells her ominously, and it's a signpost for shit about to escalate and go down. During their sessions, he describes key moments in his life, which she dismisses as delusions. As these events are recounted to Brunel, we see Mauler as a young boy confined to bed with measles, psychologically terrorised by his fire and brimstone Irish nanny, Frances Tomelty. He prays to the devil that she burn in hell, and guess what? Next day, she takes to her bed and dies. Then he's on holiday with his distant, dispassionate and derogatory arbitrary parents. He wills their car to move, and it sends them plunging over a cliff to their deaths. At boarding school, a sadistic teacher punishes his insolence by forcing him to pick up leaves in the rain. The school burns down, and the teacher and 4 pupils are incinerated. In adulthood, fatal or unsettling events persist around him. His career as a defense lawyer ends after he delivers a courtroom speech expressing his ferocious disgust at humanity and thus offending the judge, who soon after dies of a heart attack with a look of abject terror on his face. After an acidic confrontation, Mauler's unfaithful wife dies in a car crash with her lover after she leaves him. When his next-door neighbour and his neurotic spouse disturb his writing with an argument and the wife threatens to jump out the window,
"None of you care! Have a good night and jump and end it all!" "For God's sakes, woman, jump!"
and she does. Mauler approaches a psychic, Michael Horden, who, when he looks at Mauler's palm, has a complete nervous collapse. Finally, Mauler invites Zonfeld to his home to convince her. In her presence, he brings down a passenger jet, which crashes into a high-rise building with a cataclysmic loss of life. When the NASA mission turns into a disaster, it is Zonfeld who visits Mauler's apartment and batters him repeatedly with a statue of Napoleon. Figuring this out and starting to believe that Mauler has telekinetic powers, Brunel doesn't immediately arrest the psychiatrist, which gives Zonfeld the chance to make another attempt to murder Mauler in his hospital bed. However, he opens his eyes and compels her to commit suicide by lethal injection in her own office. Confounding medical science, Mauler's body fails to improve, but his monitored brain activity is ever increasing. Based on Mauler telling Zonfeld, "I will bring the whole edifice down on their unworthy heads," along with a clue in some notes of one of his journals, Brunel realizes he is going to cause a catastrophe at the dubiously named Minster Cathedral. A prestigious televised fundraising service is being held there with VIPs from the government and the royal family in attendance. From his hospital bed, and despite Brunel managing to convince the assistant commissioner, Harry Andrews, of the impending disaster, Mauler brings the house down, so to speak. Brunel races to the hospital and unplugs Mauler's life support, too late to prevent the death and destruction. Despite appearing dead, Mauler's hand twitches, and given a pen, he writes Windscale on a notepad. A protest at Windscale nuclear power plant appeared on TV previously. It's Mauler's next target. His eyes open once more and the EEG monitor springs back to life. Brunel and the medical team look on in helplessness and horror at the prospect of an imminent nuclear holocaust as the film ends on that apocalyptic note. The Medusa Touch, plot-wise, sticks fairly close to the Peter Van Greenaway novel on which it's based. The detective was British in the book though, one Inspector Cherry. Substituting the Brunel character and having him played by Lino Ventura, an Italian actor raised in France, was probably to add some appeal for European audiences. Plus, it was part financed by French backers, so what are you gonna do? I think the Medusa Touch lends itself more effectively to viewing on the small screen than in the cinema. In the 70s, ITV used to occasionally make and screen feature-length television plays and dramas, two which spring randomly to my mind: The Naked Civil Servant in 75 with John Hurt, and Charlie Muffin, a spy thriller fronted by David Hemmings in 79, both coincidentally directed by Jack Gold. The production values, look and feel of the Medusa Touch mirrors to some extent the pared-back qualities of those more modestly budgeted affairs. It's a positive that the Medusa Touch has none of the glamour and stylistic overload or high-end visual whiz-bang effects of Hollywood. As fantastically ridiculous as the premise is, the dense and dark visuals, steady pacing, and unfussy authentic framing results in an unnerving true-to-life effect. More down-to-earth than most, adding a faint overlay of plausibility to the screamingly implausible. What is also a welcome enhancement are the performances. Burton is truly convincing as Mauler, one of the most misanthropic fictional characters you're likely to encounter this side of Ebenezer fucking Scrooge. Only there are no whimsical Christmas spirits to hand to guide Mauler towards redemption. Throughout, he remains dedicated to anger, rage, and utter contempt aimed at just about everyone and everything. A god he doesn't believe in, organised religion, governments, the judicial system, and people in general. Burton's sonorous voice as he delivers some vitriolic and scathing dialogue dripping with eloquent venom, and his pitted, melancholic visage and piercing stare combine to make him a strangely appealing monster. The only solution Mauler has to offer for mankind's ills is death and destruction. Yet, because he is a tormented soul himself, Burton manages to invest some shred of sympathy in his portrayal. From the mistreated child to the adult deathbringer raging past the point of no return, he is wronged by others and driven to distraction, as we all would be under such circumstances. Only difference is, he can hit back, in the most terminal and devastating of ways. Lino Ventura is a fine actor who delivers a cool, lugubrious performance as the skeptical and world-weary cop Brunel, like a Gallic Walter Matthau, and Lee Remick looks absolutely stunning, picture perfect, her eyes almost as piercing as Burton's. The supporting cast is peppered with veteran character actors like Harry Andrews, Michael Hordern, Jeremy Sherlock Holmes Brett, Alan Badell, Gordon Jackson as a perplexed hospital consultant, Derek Jacobi as Mauler's camp publisher, Michael Byrne as Duff, Brunel's temporary police partner. No shortage of acting talent. The score by Michael J. Lewis is decent enough if by the numbers, and cinematography by Arthur Ibbotson is steady and pragmatic, very straightforward with no unnecessary window dressing. Jack Gold's direction is similarly unpretentious and no-nonsense in approach. He makes frequent use of what's happening on TV news broadcasts to flesh out events, using real broadcasters of the time, Gordon Honeycomb and James Burke, which adds more of a sense of realism to the proceedings. I've often wondered about the relevance of the title, and all I can connect it with is the Medusa of mythology could turn people who looked upon her to stone, more specifically people who looked directly into her eyes. Throughout both the film and the novel, recurring mention is made of Mauler's strangeness, how people couldn't hold eye contact with him, and those he turns his malevolent gaze upon freeze and their blood runs cold.
Had the most disconcerting eyes. One could never return his gaze in conversation.
His ex-legal colleague muses, "Fair cop, mate, that's enough to put the shits up you." It's something of a slow burn, the initial thrust, until the latter stages being, is Mauler delusional, mad, obsessed with disaster, and mistakenly associating himself with it, or is he actually able to cause it? The earlier events in his life, those tragedies, lend themselves to rational explanation, as bad luck, coincidence, or happenstance, until of course he crashes the airliner and demolishes a cathedral, that is. Up to then, though, the uncertainty adds a thought-provoking element. About the plane crash and the cathedral collapse, the model work on both is just a cut or two above the sort of thing you would have seen in the Doctor Who episodes of the 70s. Faster editing of the chaos and carnage covers a multitude of sins, but you'll need to take into account the technology of the decade and the budget constraints in making some allowances. Personally, I think it's a fine little fantasy horror thriller with a compelling central character, played with remarkable commitment and relish by Richard Burton. It's hard to justify, I know, but I like Mauler in much the same way as I like Hannibal Lecter. Both are extreme examples of the anti-hero, with an emphasis on the anti and next to no heroism whatsoever. And some of Mauler's lines are so well written and so savagely enunciated by Burton, they give you that deliciously evil tingle. And that does it for me. One of his zingers,
"I will bring the whole edifice down on their unworthy heads,"
snarled with a vocal drizzle of torn silk and ashes, was sampled by the Manic Street Preachers for their track Ready for Drowning in 1998. Later, the same band would reference the film title in their song Leviathan in 2005. So, someone out there was giving the movie some attention. Well done, lads. Why the hate? Worst film in 1978? I sincerely fucking doubt that. In fact, on an objective level, I utterly refute it. That year gave us Omen 2, The Playbirds, Convoy, The Wiz, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, The Stud, The Manitou, It Lives Again, The Betsy, and The Swarm! And a veritable landslide of substandard, mind-raping dross so lousy it could convert a pack of hyenas to veganism. Get a fucking grip. Worst film in 1978 in what universe? It's a good movie, decently scripted, solidly directed, well acted, and poses some interesting questions as to how we, as human beings, interact with and process death and disaster. Do we feel empathy, any responsibility, or are we so desensitized by relentless exposure to media coverage that we just shrug and accept it and feel almost nothing, beaten into detachment? Flipping through Mauler's scrapbooks of global catastrophe, Brunel ponders the same, and thus encourages the audience to do likewise. You won't get that in Grease or Jaws 2. Not that you should, but I'm just saying. Thanks in abundance for your time and attention. I'm always impressed when anyone gives it, and likewise grateful. If you've enjoyed in any way, please hit like, didn't like, leave a comment, and or consider subscribing to help motivate my sorry ass beyond the self-indulgent in producing future content. You never know, it might work. Later, pilgrims.